Vicky. Welcome everyone to the first panel of the day, States Modernizing Energy Policy. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today. We have a great lineup of speakers from all over the country representing a very diverse set of states with different energy mixes, different electricity structures, different regulatory paradigms, and different policy tools that they're using to modernize the grid. You can find the full bios at the registration desk, so I'm just going to introduce them to you. First off, the commissioners Lorraine, Akiba from state of Hawaii. Our next speaker is going to be Asim Haque from Ohio. Third, Dan Lipschultz from Minnesota. And finally, from our home state, John Rhodes. First, a few housekeeping items. We're going to be taking questions from the audience. If you look at your tables, you see index cards and pens. So if you write down your questions, your name, your affiliation, Nina and Natasha are going to be collecting them periodically and bring them to me. In the interest of time, I'm going to collect questions and ask them together so that we can move from one topic to another. Without further ado, I would like to invite Lorraine Akiba, Commissioner from Hawaii, to the podium.
Good morning and aloha, everyone. All right. Well, I was very impressed to see all of you here, and Burcin says that, and Bethany said that some of you came here very early at 8 o'clock. So that would have been about, I think, midnight or close to midnight for my time. Well, no, I guess it would have been 2 in the morning. So I'm bright and perky now, and I'm enthused and inspired by all of you here, and what Dean Emeritus Rivez said as a prelude. There's very important work to get done. So let me, let's see, advance our slides. Okay, let me start with this slide. How many of you have heard of the Hokulea? Anybody heard? Oh, nobody's heard of the Hokulea? Don't be shy if you know what that is. Okay. Well, I started with this slide because the Hokulea just completed a 2-year journey circumnavigating the globe. The Polynesian Voyaging Society wanted to show that Polynesian wayfinders were able to circumnavigate the globe. And if you don't know about Polynesian wayfinders, I'd suggest you Google Polynesian Voyaging Society or Google the name Nainoa Thompson for information on that. But basically, Native Hawaiians and Polynesians navigated the world, navigated the seas using the stars as their compass. And Polynesians and Native Hawaiians practiced, before it was popular to do so, sustainability. Coming from islands, of course, you needed to practice sustainability, and took as a hallmark of their value to be stewards of the planet. And so therefore, I start with this slide as inspiration, because Nainoa Thompson, just as we completed this 2-year journey around the world a few months ago, spoke to thousands of people gathered in Hawaii to say, it's all about, and we use these Hawaiian words, malama honua, which means care for the planet, because there's no plan B for planet Earth. I mean, notwithstanding Elon Musk's plan to take us to Mars in a few years on a rocket, we have to deal with the issues today. And you as lawyers are the vanguard of that stewardship of the planet, as the dean so eloquently outlined, the recent activities that all of you are undertaking. So with that in mind, I want to begin my talk to outline to you what I think is actually a very bright picture. As you know, we were among one of the first states to join the U.S. Climate Alliance, 14 states that have challenged and continue to remain committed to the Paris Agreement and the Paris Accord. And I believe truly that state commissions are at the forefront of change. And this was even before, when we had the Obama administration. The Hawaii PUC, and there's some copies of the seminal white paper that we issued back in 2014 at the front desk if you want to take a look at it. We issued a white paper called The Inclinations on Hawaii's Utilities of the Future, and what we thought would be a strategic roadmap to guide our utilities on the path of truly integrating renewable energy, of modernizing the grid, of addressing customers and giving customers empowerment and customer choices, and We talked about very specific things in the regulatory parlance of the integrated grid of the future, addressing distributed energy resources, community renewables, time of use rates, demand response, to go along with energy storage options, and really accomplish and implement much of what's been discussed up until that time. As you know from being in New York, the New York PSC at the same time initiated the New York REV proceeding. It was kind of like this trifecta. On the East Coast, New York was doing, the leadership of the New York REV. On the West Coast, it was California, as you can see from my slide. California was leading in terms of energy storage and some of the distribution level planning. And we in Hawaii, way far away on the west of the Pacific Rim, were doing what we needed to do. We issued a very comprehensive strategic roadmap, just because we had, by virtue of customer uptake, gone beyond what anybody else had done in terms of distributed rooftop solar, in terms of integration of what we were previously talking about for the last 5 years. It was phenomenal how much that took off. And other public utilities commissions followed. You wouldn't think of regulators being the vanguard, but a lot of PUCs were out there in front, and their representatives are here today. I mean, we have Commissioner Lipschultz. The Minnesota PUC establishes the valuation of solar tariff, which really helped us to articulate the contributions of what distributed energy and solar bring to the grid, in addition to, it started us on thinking of what grid services distributed energy resources also use from the grid, and community solar programs from which we've learned and initiated our own programs. Colorado and Maine PUCs also did regulatory frameworks for developing and encouraging community solar programs, so it wasn't just the haves and those early adopters who tend to come from very high net worth zip codes that are having access to renewables, but it was the underserved and renters and folks that couldn't necessarily, low-income folks who couldn't necessarily have the benefits of distributed energy resources. In Illinois PUC, Commissioner Sheehan and his commission began to issue orders regarding grid modernization and smart grid technology, because these are the tools for the future to integrate renewables, as well as Commissioner Haque is here, Chair Haque is here to talk about Ohio and the Ohio PUC's leadership role in terms of regulatory proceedings to review technology and regulatory innovations regarding grid modernization. So states are at the forefront of change. We are the leadership, and individual states that aren't here today are actually doing as similar actions. So let me share with you why and what we look like in Hawaii, because it's a very different grid system. We're basically separate island grids. So we've got 6 separate grids, and we have 4 electric utilities, 3 of which are part of an investor-owned utility company, Hawaiian Electric Companies, one of which is a utility cooperative, Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. And I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, because you can see how high penetration of renewables we have. On some days, the high amount of daytime renewables is like over 50%, because most of our generation comes from solar and wind. And on individual distribution circuits, you can see that we have a high amount of penetration of what may not be reflected per capita in this slide, but we basically have a high amount of distributed resources, rooftop solar. So on some days, on some circuits, individual distribution circuits, the solar exceeds at 250% of minimum daytime load, which is incredible. People never thought that distribution circuits could take that much intermittent renewable energy, but we do, which shows that the path forward includes being able to use technologies that people never thought were available, and being able to get off some of the fossil fuel baseload that some of the old world thinkers thought was impossible to get off of because of the way the system runs. So let me share with you why we were what we've done, and it's a series of different, when I look back at this and think of all the dockets we have open and all the things we've done with a very small commission, we're not like CPUC. We don't have a cast of thousands and 900 employees. We have 35 very hardworking, dedicated public servants who have cranked out orders, and along with a very diligent working commission, or commission with commissioners who are working commissioners, we've issued over the years several orders. And we started in 2014. As I said, this even started before I came onto the commission. And we've tried to implement new business models so that our utilities can become world-leading operators of a very high renewable energy resource grid and with affordable access for all customers. And we really stress the need for utilities to transform, not just to do the window dressing on the set, but to truly transform their business models to meet these needs and to achieve the Hawaii clean energy future. And we've reviewed pricing of services to reflect these new business and technical demands. Just as Minnesota was looking at the valuation of solar, we're thinking of unbundling these services, that you have to value each component. People are willing to pay, hundreds on their cell phone bill, but they're not willing to pay for services that they receive from the grid on their electric bill. Customers need to understand there's a cost to those services and not take those services for granted. But that's part of what we do as regulators, to educate customers and to also make transparent those costs and those values so that they can work on those things. I just want to say recent legislation we enacted, we were the first state to enact legislation to achieve 100% renewable by 2045. And as I said, we're one of the first states to pass legislation to affirm the climate accord. So I'm just basically telling you that you can envision the integrated grid of the future. Hawaii is that living laboratory. We're implementing real-time distributed energy resources. You have these slides, so I'm just gonna, I took this slide from the EPRI Integrated Energy Network, because it's all about the grid serves as an integrated energy kind of highway for not just electric sector, water, telecom, gas, transportation, as we begin to decarbonize and electrify transportation as well. So we're going to use cleaner energy and energy efficiency to accomplish this. This is just a graphic of what we started back in 2011, the Jump Smart Maui project, where we did accomplish on a pilot basis the integrated energy network using distributed energy resources at the customer level, whether that's plug-in electric vehicles, rooftop PV, interactive grid, interactive water heaters, combined with storage resources at both the transmission and distribution level, to combine both central plant resources with more distributed resources to achieve what we would say would be the virtual power plant optimal view. We did energy storage before CPUC drove the volume, but thank God to CPUC for creating a volume market that began to drive prices down. But as you can see, there's a bunch of energy storage system projects. In fact, Kauai, our little Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, was the first in the country to do a solar and storage fully dispatchable peaker plant, which underscores the need and the case for the fact that we don't need fossil fuel peaker plants anymore. We can use solar and storage to accomplish those same assets and provide ancillary services to the grid. So we define distributed energy resources not just as rooftop PV, but energy storage, demand response, and energy efficiency, and those are the tools that are needed to create the integrated grid of the future. Customer choice, microgrids involving customers is the same thing. I mean, I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm kind of going quick over these slides here. But mainly one of our main orders, and you'll have this in the material, so I don't have to go over this, I don't want to make this a law lecture, and we want to save time for Q&A. So all of our dockets, and that's what I said, we had a number of dockets. We had an IRP docket, we had a distributed energy resources policy docket, in which we clearly established, the framework for the DER tariffs, and we tried to continue to work on what you do when you reach a penetration level like we have, like I said, at 250% of minimum daily load, where no longer are you looking at, incremental slow growth, but we had a significant amount of PV adoption, and that was causing technology challenges for the grid. And therefore, the NEM, the Net Energy Metering Tariff, which was a good tool in the beginning to kickstart this, was no longer viable. So we changed that tariff structure to a customer self-supply, a smart export supply, which was to incentivize storage so that customers could be part of providing ancillary services to the grid. And we also have the demand response docket, which is still ongoing, and which we tried to make sure that a demand response could be part of what we needed to do to support the grid, and customers could be part of that as well. We're still looking at that, but it's basically where customers can provide capacity services I mean, who thought that, behind the meter and customer-sided resources could provide fast frequency response, regulating reserves, replacement reserves, and capacity needs? Nobody even 5 years ago would have thought about that, but the technology is there, and the innovation happening at the grid edge allows us to do this. So we wanted to make sure that the tariff structures were there, and that demand response is one of the first fuel tools that we use, along with energy efficiency, to integrate more renewables onto a very robust grid. And then to address what consumer advocates always remind us is it's not about just the haves and the early adopters. We must make this accessible to all customers, and therefore community-based renewables tariff legislation was passed in our state by the legislature, and I know Commissioner Lipschultz is going to talk more about Minnesota leading us in the community solar. But we basically wanted to do time of use rates, because when you get to a point in the grid like ours, where you have so much renewables, and especially solar, the time of use rates are key to shifting load, because load can be a very good instrument in helping to manage that grid. So the old time of use rates for peak and non-peak were based on a central plant model, and now we want to have time of use rates which deal with the excess over-generation of distributed energy resources during the day. So from 10 to 3, we have a midday rate, which is the cheapest rate, because that's when we want people to use the excess solar from rooftop PV and other intermittent renewables like utility scale solar. And we have an off-peak time in the night when we curtail wind, and we incentivize customers to use that. So let me just go, I know, let me indulge me. I came all the way from Hawaii. I know I'm 1 minute over. But I think these people want to hear what I have to say, so indulge me for another minute. I know, it's like, okay, stop being so pushy. But as a lawyer, a female litigator, no less, I came from a litigation background, so pardon my assertiveness here, but I'm channeling my inner Wonder Woman. That's why I'm wearing my red dress. So just these 2 slides I think are really important, and then they're reflected in some of the things that, the handouts that I've given you. The future trends and actions in transforming the energy industry. Really, the advances in technology in Silicon Valley, and now you see that there is a clash in the global economy as the technology tightens and the innovators, and it's not just the Googles and the Oracles and of the world, but it's basically all the entrepreneurs that are thinking of new and innovative tools that help us to better utilize our energy, and also to capture value in things that we never thought that we would in the home, and to manage HVAC. Who thought that you'd have a smart home, you could talk to Siri or Alexa, and all these things would be managed in your home. So with the advanced usage of all these technology, there's advanced usages of data analytics for energy management services and operations of the grid, real-time, predictive analytics, and real-time management, and from customer resources. With the Internet of Things, utilities have become energy management service providers to customers and fill the role of advisor and facilitator of all things energy. And that is a major paradigm shift that many utilities are slow to make, but there are very many progressive utilities that are making that shift. And utilities need to assume the roles of being conductors of a very complex orchestra that makes up the integrated grid. That graphic I showed you when I first started to speak. Energy is also becoming more local. Community and utility engagement with community renewables, integrated energy districts or microgrids, and energy efficiency and demand response. And so the roles of digital utilities of the future, let me just leave you with this. The digital economy is being driven by technology developments, including open cloud interoperable platforms, software platforms, and grid control technology. And that's why all of us are involved with grid modernization dockets, Hawaii included. I didn't include that in my slide because we just opened that docket, and Hawaiian Electric's grid modernization plan is under active comment right now, so I did not want to say anything or add any slides so that anybody would interpret anything from me being here in New York as indicative of that docket. But big data analytics and technology tools allow for real-time visualization and really to help integrate more tools so that we can achieve the aspirational goals of integrating more energy resources and distributed energy resources onto the grid. And very important, we are moving from we are in a digital economy right now, but we are moving into what's called a virtual economy, where artificial intelligence, AI, and you see that already with sensors, drones, and machine-to-machine learning tools, Watson, IBM, I mean, it's amazing. But it is the fourth industrial revolution that we are now in the midst of, and we as regulators and you as lawyers in the area of climate and environment need to make sure that we don't forget that that wayfinding, that moral compass, navigating by the stars. There's blockchain technology and transactive energy transformation, which is happening in all kinds of other sectors as well, which is really going to change the way we do business. And utilities will need to leverage and utilize all this to continue to stay relevant across not just energy, but water and transportation sectors. So again, I leave you with the slide of Hokulea. I leave you with that slide, Malama Honua, as the takeaway today. And if I leave you with just one word, Hawaiian word that you remember besides aloha and mahalo, it is imua. And what imua means is moving forward with diligence and speed. It means never forgetting where you came from. It is kind of a battle cry in Native Hawaiian culture. Imua, even though times may be tough, even though we may have the challenge of an uncertain course ahead and maybe rough seas, it is up to you as vanguards of stewardship of the planet to continue that course. Never forget navigating by the stars, by your internal compass and what you see in the sky ahead of you. So with that inspiration from Hokulea and from Native Hawaiians, I leave you with that, so thank you.
Chairman Asim Haque from Ohio.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I'm very happy to be here to tell Ohio's story. I think it's a pretty incredible story to tell. And so I'm very happy to be invited to an opportunity like this to tell our story. So we're in New York. And what do New Yorkers know about Ohio? Probably a lot of negative things, but at the very least, we're that pesky swing state, okay? Sometimes red, sometimes blue, sometimes unfortunately red, maybe sometimes unfortunately blue. And so some of that swinginess trickles down into policymaking. And as a policymaker, that can be very challenging to navigate. And I think Ohio is one of those states from an energy perspective. We, over the past 5 years, which is about the time that I've been a commissioner at the Ohio PUC, I think we've been around the world and back. And so I'm happy to share the story of where Ohio's been and where we plan to go going forward. Many of you in the room are lawyers, and you keep up on industry trends and litigation. And so, many of the industry trends that you are keeping track of, whether it's the state subsidy issue, which results in litigation and state-federal conflicts, the shale gas revolution, what to do with energy efficiency and renewable mandates, clean power plan support and clean power plan opposition, and now grid modernization. All of it has taken place in Ohio, and all of it, again, fortunately or unfortunately, has taken place while I have been a commissioner at the Ohio PUC. So it has been an incredibly challenging universe to navigate. But again, I do believe we are on the right path, and I think that that path is very bright. So let me dive into our deck a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to do is just describe, the landscape in Ohio. How is Ohio situated from an energy perspective? And I think it's important to understand this because I think you're going to hear some universal messages on this panel, which is effectively that grid modernization or whatever other descriptors that you utilize is a really good thing. But we all have to attack it differently, and we all have to attack it differently for political reasons, and really for reasons of potentially how we are situated within the overall marketplace associated with how either our grid operates or how our markets have been crafted. And so Ohio exists in a competitive state. We are competitive both on the wholesale side as well as the retail side. So on the wholesale side, Ohio exists in a organized competitive market called PJM interconnection. In the PJM footprint, which is 13 states in the District of Columbia, our power plants that exist in the state of Ohio sell their power effectively into this marketplace, and that power either clears or does not clear within the marketplace that they're competing within. On the retail side, we have a very robust retail market. One of the bullet points there says that competitive retail suppliers provide almost 80% of the electricity supplied to Ohioans. And so again, this is sale for resale, and that 80%, I would say, does comprise quite a bit of it is our industrial and manufacturing loads that are served by competitive suppliers in the state. The residential competitive marketplace is also quite robust, but not nearly as robust as our industrial and manufacturing base, which is quite heavy in Ohio. So I was sworn in at the PUCO. I'm a John Kasich appointee. I was sworn in at the PUCO in June of 2013. And in December of 2013, the first of what I'll call we'll call them infamous PPA cases was filed at the commission in December of that same year. What these cases aim to do, they are really some seminal cases in the state federal conflict arena with respect to the state subsidy issue that we're seeing across the country. What our electric distribution utilities aim to do, specifically AEP and First Energy, was effectively buy power from its generation affiliate at cost, socialize that power or sell that power into the PJM marketplace, and whatever they didn't receive, whatever the delta of what they didn't receive, would then be socialized to customers. Okay, that was the very basic rubric. I will make a very, very long story short. Actually, one of these cases is still on rehearing. It's like on its 9th entry on rehearing. They're cases that will never die. They're always going to be with me from now till the end of time. But effectively, the PUCO granted the applications filed by First Energy and AEP. They were for predominantly state subsidies to coal units and 1 nuclear unit from First Energy. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a few months after we granted these state subsidies, stated that First Energy and AEP, and via the commission's decision, were violating affiliate waiver rules and required the FE and AEP to apply this Edgar doctrine to this particular rubric, which they would have failed, and thus First Energy and AEP effectively hit the brakes on this rubric once the FERC acted. Ohio also is a state that has a evolving generation mix. And when I say evolving, I mean it's rapid. So in 2005, we were a state whose generation mix consisted of about 88% coal. There is now pretty close to parity between natural gas and coal-fired generation in the state of Ohio, and that's a result of the good fortune of having the shale gas revolution take place, in part at least on Ohio soil, and all of the generators, the independent generators, mostly natural gas combined cycle, that have been constructed or are in the throes of being constructed in the state of Ohio as a result of the shale gas revolution. We were asked to discuss distributed generation just very briefly, and I would say that DG has very low penetration in the state of Ohio. We are not a very sunny place, and we are not a very windy place either, actually. So distributed generation, of course, distributed energy resources encompasses a lot more than that, but at least currently we don't have tremendous penetration of DG. Let me talk a little bit about Power Forward. And so I described to you what were really 3 very challenging years at the commission. mostly centering around the concept of what to do with predominantly coal-fired generation that was no longer making money in the wholesale marketplace because natural gas has effectively priced coal out of the marketplace. So we spent years looking at this issue, at least years to me at the PUC, looking at this issue, and it was my desire, once the FERC ruled on our cases, that in tandem with the Supreme Court of Ohio case dealing with the concept of transition revenue, which was effectively the Supreme Court of Ohio said, PUCO through a rider mechanism or other, stop trying to push money to your generating units. It's illegal, cut it out. In tandem with the Hughes case that came out of the Supreme Court of the United States, I made a decision that I was not going to thread the needle on trying to figure out how to make these generating units profitable anymore. And so when I was sworn in as chairman in May of last year, my primary talking point when I was sworn in as chairman is that the PUCO is out of the generation business. We're done. Okay, so that made our lives a lot easier, made the legislature's lives a little more complex. They continue to deal with requests or bills associated with trying to thread the needle to effectively provide state subsidies to either existing coal or nuclear units. My desire was to change the energy dialogue in the state of Ohio. I have the good fortune of as many of my fellow commissioners do, to travel the country, listen to wonderful speakers, provide some insight on what's going on in our particular state, and frankly, a lot of the feedback that I received is that Ohio appeared to be a very backwards-looking state, and it's not where I wanted the state to be, and I don't think necessarily that it needs to be that way. Again, we are this pesky swing state, and a lot of good can come out of that from a policy perspective. So, power forward. This slide is actually wrong. And so I have texted my aide, who is packing her bags right now, leaving the PUCO. I'm kidding. That was a joke. But actually, the two pillars of power forward. The pillar on the left side should read innovation, okay? And it's innovation, both technological and regulatory innovation. And the second pillar is really one that I have yet to obtain IP protection on, but I should, is the concept of enhancing the customer electricity experience. That's it. Those are the two pillars upon which Power Forward was built. We have trailblazers, trailblazing states that have come before us. Commissioner Akiba's commission is, of course, one of them. I've got a commissioner here from Minnesota and their E21 endeavor, the new chair of the New York Commission with the REV proceeding. And these were trailblazing proceedings, but we're all situated differently. I knew I had to present a business case to advance grid modernization in the state of Ohio. And the business case to be presented in my state was the concept of how are we going to better the lives of customers in the state of Ohio through innovation. Power Forward is a three-phase process. The first phase, a glimpse of the future, was really building that business case. The second phase was really about grid architecture. It says exploring technologies. It was really about grid architecture primarily. And phase three is where the gloves will come off and we'll have, you know, an MMA-style proceeding about rate making and regulation and who's going to profit in this new world and what the marketplace will look like. But that we plan to have first quarter of next year. Let me just give you a few snippets of what we've learned in phase one. What we learned in phase one in trying to present the business case, and it was very, very illuminating, is that generally speaking, consumers are not happy with their utilities, okay? We received data, and it was pretty, I thought it was pretty well resounding data, that consumers actually view utilities so low on the customer satisfaction scale they were actually ranked below rental car companies. And what was funny is that the utilities were not shocked by this at all. You know, we, as their regulators, were shocked by this, but the utilities were not shocked by this at all. And so when you're talking about trying to build the business case for why we want to create a better future for customers, the presentation of this data and the presentation of the business case was extremely important. What was also really fascinating was the utilities want to go here. And why do they want to go here in the state of Ohio? Because they are not making money in the generation space anymore. They're not making money on centralized generation anymore. They are either retiring or divesting in full their generation portfolios. And now, when they're looking at places to try and invest capital, this is the next potential gold mine, okay? So when you really think about it, this is great. This is great public policy. This is a place where the utilities want to go. This can potentially better the lives of human beings and businesses in my state, and there's governmental will. So it's a great, great policy endeavor. Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative was the source for the rental car piece specifically. If you want to dive into some of their materials, it's all very good. On the exploring technologies piece, this is really hard for regulators. And so I do think it's necessary, though, for commissioners and their staffs to have a full understanding of the engineering and grid architecture necessary to advance the modernized world. If not, you're going to throw darts, okay? And so that's not me preaching. That is just me as a human being, as a person with a mind, who's saying, how am I possibly going to evaluate this application that a utility submits to advance their grid if I don't fully understand practically, engineering-wise, how the grid works and how we actually can advance based upon what the eventual goal of what we hope for here. Last few slides. If you are interested in following Power Forward, there are many ways to stay up to date. We have a website bump out from our traditional puco.ohio.gov. We have archived all of our presentations. We send out an email blitz about once every couple weeks about what we're reading. The game plan is, let me just give you sort of the end vision of this, is after phase 3, we plan to create what I'll call a vision piece. It will be, my hope is, a comprehensive roadmap for how we plan to take on the marketplace that we want to create, the opportunities for customers that we want to create, and then the roadmap for investments and the marketplace for grid modernization in the state of Ohio. We're all situated differently. In the state of Ohio, we have 4 different certified territories. And part of what we're trying to do is get out ahead of this so we can have a comprehensive vision that not just customers of AEP or not just customers of First Energy can really enjoy. Thank you very much for the opportunity again this morning. I'm excited for questions.
Commissioner Dan Lipschultz from Minnesota.
Well, you know, I don't know if you know what it's like to stand up here and have to follow Wonder Woman. And after hearing Commissioner Haque, I'm following Wonder Man, too. a new superhero.
Too kind, too kind.
Just gave you that title. Our chair, Nancy Lang, our commission chair, asked me, how am I going to open this up? And I said, I don't know. And she said, well, you know, why don't you use my shtick, she said. And her shtick is the grouchy regulator. But I'm not grouchy, damn it, so I can't do that. Commissioner, I know Burcin suggested that I talk a little bit about what's worked in Minnesota and what hasn't worked in Minnesota. And I'm going to focus on what has worked, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about some things that maybe haven't worked. But Burcin also suggested that I first of all give you an overview of the electric utility industry in Minnesota. And so here it is. As in most states, our investor-owned utilities are regulated, vertically integrated monopolies. Now, any resemblance between the character on your right and any utility executives in Minnesota is purely coincidental. But I can tell you, I don't know this for a fact, but I think we can assume that those utility executives, when they look at members of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, see the character on the left. Now, I think most of you know what a vertically integrated utility is. It's a utility that owns distribution, transmission, and generation. They provide all three exclusively within exclusive service territories, fully regulated at all levels, distribution, generation, and transmission by the State Regulatory Commission, of which I'm a member. There are 5 of us. We have 3 investor-owned utilities, and those are the vertically integrated utilities, and I'm going to talk primarily about them. They serve approximately 70% of the load in Minnesota. However, in addition to those 3 investor-owned utilities, we have 43 distribution cooperative utilities. And those 43 distribution cooperative utilities purchase their generation and transmission from 3 generation and transmission cooperative utilities. Together, those 43 distribution co-ops and 3 generation and transmission co-ops serve approximately 20% of Minnesota's load. The other 10%, the final 10% of Minnesota's load is served by about 120 small municipal utilities. So there's the landscape. Let me talk a little bit about the regulatory framework. There are really, I think, 3 pieces to Minnesota's regulatory framework. I think it's similar to a lot of states, if not most states. One piece, if you look to the far left, is the resource selection process. In the middle, you'll see rate proceedings, and at the far right, an energy efficiency program. Resource selection really divides into 2 parts. There's an integrated resource planning process. Every investor-owned utility and all 3 generation and transmission cooperative utilities are required every 2 years to file an integrated resource plan with the Commission for our approval. Those integrated resource plans include forecasted load, or demand if you want to call it, over a 15-year horizon, and then more granularly on a 5-year horizon. In addition to that forecast, an IRP as we call it, will then propose a mix of resources to meet that demand over the long haul, the 15-year horizon, and in what's called an action plan over the more immediate 5-year horizon. The second piece to resource selection is what we call certificate of need proceedings. And those are the proceedings in which a utility will actually propose to build a generation facility or transmission facility in the state of Minnesota. They have to get Commission approval to do that. And I think the important thing is to look at the sort of list of considerations that go into either an integrated resource plan approval or approval of a specific plant. The least cost principle applies across the board. The least cost resource is the resource that gets selected or approved by the Commission. But note that there are renewable energy standards that have to be met. By 2025, every investor-owned and every cooperative utility has to meet its energy demand with a 25% renewable resource. 25% of its resources have to be, generation has to come from renewable sources. More importantly, there's a renewable preference provision in statute that we have to apply. And in all these resource selection proceedings, the utility has to select a renewable resource to meet the demand or projected forecasted demand unless a non-renewable resource can be shown by the utility to be less costly. And that's less costly after including environmental externality values, which up until recently haven't been very significant, but I'll get to that in a minute. They've just gone way up. Rate proceedings are less important, I think, for discussion today, except in 2 respects. First of all, if a utility doesn't follow through on its integrated resource plan that we've approved, the real consequence for them is that anything they seek cost recovery for, let's say they decide to build a coal plant and they weren't authorized to do so, they're not going to get cost recovery. That wouldn't be a prudent investment because it would be inconsistent with the resource plan they were required to file and that we approved. Rate design, I think, is the most important piece of rate making that really gets to the issue of the evolving electric utility industry and resource selection. Because in rate design, you can influence what gets built and when it gets built. Renewable energy riders is another component of rate making. Minnesota law authorizes utilities to get rider recovery and not wait for the next rate case. In other words, to recover their costs through riders if the resource is a renewable resource, wind, for example. We have an energy efficiency program that has saved a lot of energy over the last 20 years. Now, what does all this mean? I think those three pieces of our regulatory framework, resource selection in particular, has us on a clear and irreversible path where we have renewable energy, energy efficiency, some natural gas, and DER, distributed energy resources, moving in, and coal clearly moving out. And I can tell you, we'll never see another coal plant built in Minnesota, but that's not really inconsistent with what's happening around the rest of the country. We're probably not going to see many, if any, coal plants going forward converted to natural gas. What we're going to see is more and more renewable and perhaps more energy efficiency, although that's going to be harder since we've had so much success to date achieving energy efficiency through some of the more low-hanging fruit. And let me give you some examples. Minnesota Power, one of the three investor-owned utilities, today provides 72% of its energy with coal. In 7 years, that number is going to be less than half. And you can see what's happening. It's essentially being displaced not by gas, but by renewables. Look at Xcel Energy. Xcel Energy currently provides 37% of its electric energy from coal. That's down from previous numbers 10 years ago, but you can see the dramatic increase in the percentage of renewables and big drop in the percentage of coal as a part of its portfolio. Maybe the most interesting example that I think really illustrates the reach of this evolution in the resource mix in Minnesota is Otter Tail Power. Otter Tail Power is the third and smallest and clearly most rural investor-owned utility in Minnesota. And look at this. In the next 5 years, this utility is going to move from a capacity of coal, from a 55% coal capacity to a 30% coal capacity. That's their nameplate capacity. Right now, 55% of their generation mix is coal. It will be 30% in 5 years. Renewable energy as a component of Otter Tail's portfolio is going to go up from 24% to 36%. And another important point to note here, right now that current 24% is primarily hydro. That 36% will be almost all wind. And I thought an interesting example came up in Otter Tail's last resource plan of how important wind is in Minnesota. And we are different from Ohio. That's the point of federalism, and I want to talk about that in a minute. Otter Tail came to us with a proposal, and they proposed to retire a large coal plant. And they proposed to replace that with 200 megawatts of wind, 30 megawatts of solar, and a 250 megawatt gas peaker plant. But what you need to know about this is that gas peaker plant isn't going to run very much. That gas peaker plant is there just in case you don't have enough wind and solar power to meet the need. And essentially, it's really intended to meet reliability requirements of our MISO. It's really not intended to provide much energy. And that's key from an environmental standpoint because you can build a gas peaker, and if it doesn't run much, you don't have a lot of carbon or any other emissions coming from that plant. And to illustrate what's happening in Minnesota, and I think across the country, certainly in the Midwest, I'll quote a utility executive which shocked me a year ago who said, wind is the new base load. And here's how that works. With the developing and evolving technology for wind, especially in the Midwest where you have a really good wind resource, you're looking at capacity factors for wind. That is how often it's running, of 40 to 50% and perhaps as high as 60 and 70%. In other words, wind isn't this unreliable variable resource that you hope will generate power when the wind's blowing. The wind blows most of the time, almost everywhere, certainly in our area. And with these more sophisticated, higher wind facilities, you're capturing a lot of wind power. And when you have an integrated MISO system, you can actually use that system as a de facto battery. And if you have a lot of wind on the system and that wind drops off, there are other resources throughout the MISO region that can contribute more power during those times when the wind power falls off. And conservation, I think, is worth noting here, that third piece, the energy efficiency piece to our regulatory world. That has produced, as you can see here, an incredible amount of savings over the last 20 years. We've avoided the equivalent of 10 Prairie Island nuclear plants. And what's significant about this, I think, is there are two components to that energy efficiency program. It's called the Conservation Improvement Program. One element of it is a goal. Utilities have to set a goal for energy savings as a result of conservation. But more importantly, there is an actual incentive that utilities get through that success. They get to keep, their shareholders get to keep 10% of the energy savings in dollars that they achieve through whatever programs they implement. Carbon reduction, by the way, our carbon sort of footprint of our electric industry is down 20% since 2005. And all of this has happened without any spike in utility prices, which is interesting because that was the horror story that was put out by some who were thinking that Minnesota moved too fast. We still have relatively low rates and really relatively low bills compared to the national average. And we have highly reliable service. That hasn't decreased at all with all the variable wind on the system. And in contrast, I think, to what Commissioner Haque was talking about in Ohio, the American Customer Satisfaction Index, which is really the Bible for companies to use internally to measure their customer satisfaction, shows that utilities score fairly well nationally and even slightly better in Minnesota in customer satisfaction. A number of utilities are viewed by their customers as a trusted source of service. And I think part of that, at least in a state like Minnesota where they are heavily regulated, is they are required to do things which are really, I think, in the utility's own interest. One example, a utility that gets a call from a customer has to answer that call or all those calls within 20 seconds 85% of the time. Now, think about your cable broadband provider. If you get answered within 20 minutes, you're going to have a ticker tape parade here in New York. I'm down to a minute. It's not all rosy. It's as good as it sounds in Minnesota. The same pressures that apply in New York and Ohio and Hawaii, of course, are sort of active in Minnesota. We have relatively flat load growth, which puts upward pressure on rates. We have a relatively, I'd say a very peaky system, and I don't think that's atypical. I think it's pretty common around the country, where the vast majority of power is used during a very, very small part of the day. And those are things we have to work on. And here's what we're looking ahead as our next steps to deal with those issues. We have a grid modernization process or proceeding in place to modernize the distribution grid. We have a rate design reform proceeding in place to move towards more sophisticated granular pricing, where prices will be on a time of use basis, perhaps with critical peak pricing. And then we have a performance-based rate-making docket open to try to integrate performance measures and performance standards into the compensation mix or compensation calculus for utilities. And I want to go back here for a second to environmental externalities. We just had a big, very contentious proceeding, and by a 3-2 vote, we adopted what you see highlighted in the middle of this page. We didn't adopt the social cost of carbon values, but we adopted the social cost of carbon methodology and came up with values very similar to the values that were reflected in the federal social cost of carbon valuation. We ended up with a lower number on the low range by using the 2001 damage cost horizon rather than the 2003 damage cost horizon. But we used the 2003 on the high end, yet we used a 3% discount instead of a 2.5% discount. And we can talk about that if you're interested in the discussion afterwards. But you can see in the point here, I think, is the dramatic increase from the current carbon values to the values that will now apply going forward. And you need to couple those with the criteria pollutant valuation that we did, which for the first time will now value PM 2.5, which is really a deadly pollutant. It's linked clearly and irrefutably to lung cancer and all sorts of other respiratory and heart ailments. And that's the end.
Club. Please, John Rhodes from New York.
Hi. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending. It's good to see friends that I know, friends of the work scattered through the audience. And it's also good, really good to be on this panel with a set of colleagues that are kind of new colleagues for me, because I'm a brand new commissioner. I was appointed to the commission just about 3 months ago, or sworn into the commission just about 3 months ago, Public Service Commission of New York. Before that, I spent nearly 4 years with basically New York's Clean Energy Agency, NYSERDA. So though I'm new in the role, I represent continuity in the commission's direction, because in my prior incarnation, I was one of the folks developing the strategies, and worked very closely with my predecessor, Roger Ziebelman. And New York is, in New York, we're in a really good state. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. We have the institutions, we have the policies to do a lot of good work here. We've got fantastic leadership. So that's a good thing. And I think one of the themes, sometimes explicit, sometimes an undercurrent, is that a lot of action is now happening at the state level. And it's truer since November, but it was true before November, given some of the realities in Washington in terms of getting things done. And New York has been, a state that's been in a position to do a lot of good things. So we're in a good condition, and we're in a good geography. And we do that pulled together under Governor Cuomo's Reform in the Energy Vision, REV, which places New York as having among the most forward-thinking and comprehensive energy policies in the nation. And so we're seizing the moment, we're seizing the opportunity in everything that comes before any of our entities, and PSC, that means rate cases, that means the broader REV proceedings, that means the clean energy standard that we adopted last year. In everything that comes before us, we are seeking to create the regulatory framework that will drive investments to build the clean, distributed, and resilient energy system that we need, and to do it in a more equitable and cost-effective way. And we're doing that because we can. We're doing it because we think we must. We've got carbon issues, we've got cost issues, we've got grid constraint issues, and we're doing it because it's right for New Yorkers, and it's right actually for all New Yorkers. So that's why. How is complicated in some respects, simple in others. We're doing it by harnessing new possibilities, and mainly I'm thinking about technology possibilities. So there's grid modernization developments, there's distribution edge developments, there's clean energy developments, all technology that can deliver an energy system that offers less carbon, better economics. It's going to be more distributed, and it's going to be smarter. So we need a lot of new things in the system, which means we need innovation and we need investment. And that in turn means that we have to engage community stakeholders in a deep way in order to get them aligned, get all of us aligned, and to get it right. And we have to engage industry partners as we do that. So it's our responsibility, kind of as the rule makers, to set things up as much as possible so that the investments that are going to flow in the 10, 15, $20 billion range over the next decade, so that those investments serve our policy objectives rather than wander off in some random direction or possibly even contravene our policy objective. Policy objectives that include the interests of all New Yorkers include the interests of the customers in New York, not just the entrepreneurs, not just the utilities. Now, we've done most of that work in setting, at least in terms of setting the direction and the basic strategies of REV, we meaning those who came before me. And we're moving now into a phase more of operationalization, which means getting the resources deployed that will actually make the energy system operate in a different way. So what are some of the examples? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing than how we're doing as I go through these examples. And I'm just going to presume, at least in this room, that we don't need to talk about much more about why we're doing it. But so one of the things that we're doing is with respect to distributed energy resources, DER. Prime example is the value of DER Phase 1 order, which was issued earlier this year in March. It established a framework for transitioning from net metering to a methodology that would provide a value-based compensation for DERs. And then last month, the Commission approved an implementation order for that, including detailed requirements about how to calculate new value-based compensation for solar and for other DER systems. And this is known as the value stack. Now, that can sound methodological and technique intensive. What it means is, if you want to have resources producing value, location matters and time of operation matters, and why wouldn't you recognize that when you want to pay for it? So that's what's going on there. Now, this is a big deal. This is an important, perhaps nationally leading milestone, and it's the first step to providing more accurate compensation to DER, and it becomes a reality in 5 weeks. So that's really moving. And by doing this, we create the means to have developers, the people who are going to put the money to work, know where they can get the best return on their investments. Do it here, do it so it operates in this time window. This provides the most value to the system, and I deserve a share of that value to the system. And if you want to think of this as successfully, hopefully, internalizing the externalities, the system externalities, the carbon externalities, please do so, because that's what we think we're doing. And we know this is going to spur the development of appropriately designed, appropriately sited resources, solar, energy storage, and other forms, localized forms of energy generation and energy storage. The Commission also took steps, because in all of this, if we accept costs as they are as a given, we're denying the benefits of innovation. We need to see costs come down of all these good resources. And in the same order, we actually took some steps to apply our thumbs to the scale of cost reduction, as in we want to see more. So we're moving, we signaled that we want to increase the size of community solar installations from 2 megawatts to 5 and reduce other associated costs. Large scale. So under Governor Cuomo's leadership, the state committed to up to 40% reduction, committed to, not up to, 40% reduction in greenhouse gases below 1990 levels. Then also a 50% renewable energy target, so 50% of electricity produced by renewables also by 2030. This was implemented in the Clean Energy Standard, which is a cornerstone policy. And to achieve that, the Commission implemented a set of RECs, renewable energy credits, that basically compensated developers for the attribute, the carbon freedom attribute, of what they're producing at values discovered by competition and with cost containment mechanisms. So we're being cost sensitive. And let me strike a quick note of thanks here to people in this room for your very effective support in supporting our use of the social cost of carbon in that. The Clean Energy Standard also implemented ZECs, zero emission credits, directed towards the state's nuclear fleet, in alignment with our clear policy to reduce and not to increase carbon emissions, and to support the investments needed to preserve those lowering of carbon emissions by the owners. So in all this, we need to get things built. Siting is going to be very important. We've got a lot of open space, but not that much open space. We've got very ambitious deployment goals, and so we have a careful, thoughtful siting process, Article 10, in our state, to thoroughly review applications and make sure that they make sense for all concerned, including the community. Clean Energy Standard, we the state, my old agency, NYSERDA, issued its first RFP in conjunction with a sister agency's RFP early this spring, the largest procurement ever done by any state in U.S. history of clean energy. We're looking for 2.5 million megawatt hours, 40 to 60 large-scale projects. The solicitation is ongoing. I'm not supposed to say too much about it. I'm allowed to use the word robust. How about, I'll leave it right there. And it's very cool because some of the projects that responded also included novel features. Well, first, we're getting large-scale solar for the first time in the state, but interestingly to me, we're getting storage included in some of the proposals, which is really a terrific step forward. Offshore wind, earlier this year, the governor made the single largest commitment to offshore wind in the country when he put the state on a path to 2.4 gigawatts by 2030. He announced that LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority, had signed a contract for a 90 megawatt project offshore Long Island. It will be the largest project that gets offshore wind project in the state when it gets built. And that is a resource which is compelling on a number of grounds. One is where it is. And I think Dan and Asim and Lorraine have all talked about each state is unique. One of New York's uniquenesses, pardon the grammar, is we have two states from an energy perspective. We got lots of cheap energy and not a lot of congestion upstate, and we got a very crowded, congested, expensive downstate. The ocean is near downstate, and so it's this resource is beautifully located in great proximity to the load center. And costs, this can be a very cost-effective resource. Costs have come down internationally by 50% in the last 2 years, and cost parity is within striking range. And so we know that we're on the right course. Carbon pricing, I'm not sure how many of you paid attention, but earlier this month, DPS and the NISO, we have a single state ISO in New York, jointly took the first steps forward in trying to, in developing a process to get to a proposal to see should we inject carbon pricing into the wholesale market. Now this is a very compelling idea. Intuitively you can see that this is the optimal place to internalize the externality. There's ways it could work out beautifully, there's ways it could work out perversely. We're obviously going to work for the former outcome rather than the latter outcome, but in all this we're committed jointly to the principle that this could be the right instrument for state policy. And if we can make it work to deliver on the state policy goals 50 by 30 at even lower costs, we're going to embrace it. And I'll just note that New York is also a member of RGGI, which is, our local, regional electric sector carbon market. And New York just led a RGGI-wide effort to reduce to reduce the cap by 30% by 2030, which is another fantastic step forward. So we're in a good state in New York. We're in interesting times, and we have great momentum. We can do this. We do have the leadership in the state. We have the policies in the state. We have the institutions and the tools in the state. And our timing is great in terms of, you know, the technology coming online just at the right moment. In some ways, our job is kind of like, we're just trying to catch the wave, right? We're trying to catch the wave when it breaks and have policies in place that will work with the market forces in order to get the progress that we want, not in spite of them, not against them, and not indifferent to them. Work with them. So we have the technologies coming online, and we've got the partners across all sectors who are working with us. The partners include you. Thank you very much for what you've done. Thank you very much for continuing to be important friends to the work.
First, I want to thank our panelists for a very informative discussion. So since we don't have much time, I'm going to quickly go through some of my questions and some of audience questions. As a reminder, Nina and Natasha are collecting index card for questions. So first, I want to talk about renewables and renewable integration. As some of you mentioned, the costs are going down rapidly, and we're seeing a fast-paced transition, and this is partly driven by cost, but partly driven by policies. We have states with some ambitious targets like Hawaii, 100% renewable. How are you managing this fast-paced transition? What are your strategies, especially related to reliability? We hear the buzzwords, you know, reliability and baseload, and how to integrate such fast-paced renewables. And since I tried to cut you off, I'm going to start with Commissioner Akiba.
Okay. All right. It is true there is a lot of challenges with fully integrating renewables and to reach the 100% renewable energy goal. You know, let's not be, you know, Pollyanna about it. And so I think what it is just harnessing the technology tools to make sure to be able to do that. Technology is there to help us integrate more renewables. The costs of that are not that significant. I think that we just have to make sure we get the right interconnection standards. There's so much potential with the power control systems now that are in smart inverters in the solar panels, the power control systems that are in like energy storage, whether that's battery storage systems or other types of control systems that can help operate a highly renewable grid and that resource mix. So what were perceived as barriers there before are not barriers now given the technology. That's why we're all looking at grid modernization. The infrastructure must keep up with what the technology can do. And many utilities are focusing on that, as was pointed out. That's where the money is. The money is now in grid modernization. We need to change as regulators to allow cost recovery for that. Software costs are not the same as CapEx, you know, when we buy a transformer or you build a substation or you build a plant. So regulators need to think about it differently to promote and facilitate that transition. Now, that being said, I think that what we need to do too is, if you want to advance this sooner, and I would say we come from a jurisdiction where this is just taken off, I mean, in terms of distributed resources. And we did rely on a lot of support from the U.S. Department of Energy. That support is obviously not going to be there, but we have international partners who are decarbonizing. So what we have done in Hawaii, which many of the other states have, and especially in the West, we have partnered with international utilities who are decarbonizing. There's all the European utilities, Asian utilities have committed to the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. They must meet those goals, and they are looking at doing things in partnership with many of the states, because you can do things and test and pilot things in our respective states, and we get the benefit of actually achieving renewables. So Unel, Engie, Iberdrola from Europe. You've got utilities from Asia, TEPCO, KEPCO. All these utilities are partnering with our utilities and some of our innovation companies in Hawaii. And I see that trend, California, Arizona. I mean, I know some of the other commissioners here on the panel can share their own experiences. Partner, it is a global endeavor, and you can partner with other people's money and with private sector developers who are willing to engage in this area, because this is where the revenue is. And America leads in clean energy technology. That's what's so disappointing about this current administration's perspective. This is where the money is. You're leaving money on the table, and if we do leave money on the table, then other countries like China will follow to fill that void, and they're acquiring many companies, battery storage companies, software technology companies. These are American companies that are being acquired because they realize there's that potential for continued economic growth. It is about the money. It is about the bottom line, regardless of whether you speak from a heart and like I said, a moral compass of wanting to be a good steward and be sustainable. This is where it makes economic sense, and that's why companies like Duke and Southern, who are very bottom line driven, are not going to build another coal plant, I think, as Commissioner Haque said. It doesn't pencil out. The coal industry is going out because we do live in a capitalist system, and coal is no longer economically viable. But we do have to be careful of the geopolitical influences from other countries as well. So, do not be naive about it, but partner where you can to leverage those opportunities.
I'll just add that sort of the theme that I mentioned earlier, sort of technology breaking our way, storage is inherently part of the solution. Reliability is associated with, in many ways, timing mismatches, so storage solves that. And at least in New York, we've been compelled to focus on dynamic load management, right? The demand side is not a given. You can change it. And DG does that for you, demand response does that for you, energy efficiency does that for you. So it's one of the virtues of a portfolio approach that, if the success of renewables creates reliability problems, other parts, or rather reliability challenges, other parts of the portfolio can solve those to keep forward progress on the whole.
And the only thing I would add is it really depends on exactly what you're doing. Right. And in Minnesota, since it's primarily wind, it fits better with a more centralized model of utility generation. It's not distributed generation. So what is it about? Well, as Lorraine said, it's about infrastructure, in this case, transmission infrastructure. So what Minnesota did early in the day when we were starting to really push renewable energy, primarily wind, is we ordered utilities to invest in what became the CapEx program. That's a $2 billion investment in 800 miles of transmission lines, which, of course, the utilities are able to recover, so they're willing to do it if you tell them you'll authorize recovery for it. And as a result, in Minnesota today, right today, without any upgrades to our transmission or distribution system, we can accommodate 40% of the load through renewables. And that assumes that everybody else on the grid, all the other states, also meet all of their renewable targets. So without any further upgrades, you can go right to 40% renewable energy in Minnesota, with all the surrounding states increasing their renewable energy contribution, and have no threat whatsoever to reliability. And I'll add that we haven't seen any spike in energy rates either.
Can I just say one thing, too, about that reliability argument? I think it has been proven that we are going to, regardless of the arguments from Washington, D.C. about fake science and climate change denial. You've seen in terms of the hurricanes that have occurred repeatedly on the East Coast, and thank goodness, knock on wood, New York has not been affected like you were with Storm Sandy, and you've learned from that lesson. But basically, renewables are the reliability and resiliency strategy. When you have a good combination of resources and you are reliant on renewables, you can bring that system back up a lot quicker. And without dependency on fossil fuel, I mean, natural gas is a good partner with solar and renewables because of the fast ramping capability. And I think that you're seeing that in terms of the Midwest and some of the other plants that have become much more economically viable. But I would like to say that Department of Defense, I mean, Washington is not a monolithic, even though that's the perception, although there may be parts of the federal government that might be talking about rolling back the policies and the action plans that deal with climate change. A very big partner in our efforts in Hawaii is the Department of Defense. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff recently announced that they will not be revising the Climate Action Plan, and they will not be revising the reliability and resiliency plans that the military have put into effect, and which we see in our state because they are such huge customers on the grid. It is all about reliability and resiliency, and it's all about energy security, and it's about mission readiness, and the fact that solar, wind, and biomass and other renewables have allowed our energy security to continue. And in terms of dealing with aftermaths of natural disasters or geopolitical events, renewables are part of that reliability picture. So I would direct your attention to some of the things that are coming out. And even though, I mean, I think the military is smart enough, they don't, in fact, case in point, the Reliable Energy Program Office of the U.S. Navy, which was a very active part, is it still an active partner in Hawaii, changed their name to the Resiliency and Reliability Energy Program Office, so that, you kind of take you change the name, but it's still the same thing that's happening, and thank goodness for that, because I think we are going to continue to proceed. And so your DoD partners in New York, to the extent you have facilities, are going to be your strongest allies in terms of actually concretely getting whatever resources there still are from the federal government to the renewable projects that you want funded.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to distributed energy resources. We heard a lot of different approaches to incentivize DERs, whether it is transforming utility business models, rate design initiatives, the way to compensate DERs, value stacks, value of solar tariffs that are starting, or Hawaii moving past net metering with different options, grid supply, self-supply. And we heard all these different approaches. So my question is, what considerations went into picking one approach over the other? Was part of it trial and error? How was the stakeholder process?
So I guess two big dimensions. So one associated with getting the number right, and the other associated with getting the process right. So the number right is that obviously it's a principle that you do pretty much only economic good and not very much economic harm if you appropriately provide the right value to the resource. So we want to steer in that direction. It's also the case that in some cases that new value is going to be lower than folks are used to. Where the new value would be higher would be in the optimal locations, and we're still pretty foggy about where those are. So kind of the fact of the change and the fact of the fogginess means that you could slow down the industry. So we're trying to get a trajectory to the right number while not disrupting momentum in the market, because we want the industry to stay here. We wanted to get it right for the long term. The other point was that there are other states, none represented on this panel, that have had blistering contention over this very issue that has really left no one's been a winner in that process, even the ones that think they prevailed in terms of outcome. And so we were really, and this we as the commission and the staff before I got here, were really intensely focused on keeping everybody at the table so that we had an outcome that could be accepted by all. So number and process were our considerations.
You know, in Minnesota, we really haven't had a lot of distributed energy yet on the system, in large part because solar is not one of the more compelling sources of electric generation. However, that's changing with the more efficient, lower cost solar, and as we pretty much tap out how much further we can go with wind. And so what do we do? Well, I think in a vertically integrated system, in a lot of ways, it's easier to get the results you want because you can directly require that utilities implement public policy-oriented requirements. And you can still capture market forces through competitive bidding processes. And not only within each type of resource, which we have done routinely, but you can do what we did relatively recently and have an all-source bidding process. And in that process, a distributed solar project actually won the majority of, or at least a substantial portion of the bid to meet a certain Xcel Energy need. And that included the consideration of environmental externalities. So if you include externalities in your valuation or your cost counting as part of a bidding process, you will end up with more solar and probably, because it's solar, more distributed solar.
Yeah, I would just add, I think we're very similar to Minnesota in that we don't have tremendous solar penetration. But just two things to watch. I would agree with my colleague from New York. I mean, we've got to get the number right. I think we recognize that. But you know, two nuggets to watch. We are dealing with an application associated with the valuation of EV charging stations. Again, we're a very heavy manufacturing state. We've got a lot of, one huge auto manufacturer in the state and some other plants in the state as well. And we are going to have to be part of the puzzle associated with EV charging station deployment. And we're going to have to be part of the puzzle because the application has been brought to us. And so whether that application ends up being thumbs up or thumbs down, we are going to be part of the puzzle there. And how you, whether that charging station is a utility asset and how you would actually value it in the marketplace is a really interesting conundrum and something that we're dealing with right now. And then we're also, being in a fully competitive marketplace, we're also very carefully watching how the FERC NOPR on aggregation of DER and being able to sell that in the wholesale markets, how that develops under new leadership. We're very curious to see how that goes, but you know, I just wanted to add two nuggets to what my colleagues have already said.
I don't know if you probably have another question. We're running out of time, but when I heard Asim mention EVs, I thought it was an important segue to a broader point that I think is really critical. I think most of the folks in this room probably know that 2012 was a crossover point. That's the point at which most carbon emissions now, starting in 2012, come from the transportation and other sectors, not the utility sector. And so we spent a lot of time trying to discourage electric energy use. We have decoupling in Minnesota, among other things, to try to take away the incentive to increase sales of electric energy. But as we've looked at it down the road through this E21 process in Minnesota, there is a win-win scenario out there where you actually break from the past and you encourage more electric use through the transition of other industries, primarily transportation, from petroleum-based to electric-based transportation. And that is a winner for electric utilities who see their load growth relatively flat, a way to drive up sales and thereby keep per unit costs or per customer costs down. At the same time, you're decarbonizing the environment. So that's a place I think we all need to consider going, and I know we're considering that in Minnesota. And EV is where it starts, and utilities have to have, I think, as you said, Asim, a role in that.
Also, can I say ditto?
Yeah. And I think for the commissions that aren't here as well, that the electrification of transportation is politically correct load to help integrate more renewables onto the grid. So likewise, Hawaii is the Drive Electric Hawaii initiative, California, Arizona, you name it, where many of the electric vehicles are being deployed. Tesla has been, Nissan, some of the car manufacturing companies, and Tesla acquired Solar City. So in terms of the energy storage capability, they're partnering there with their own former subsidiary. So I think that is an area to watch. and also just for vehicle-to-grid support. I know San Diego Gas and Electric has done a lot with vehicle-to-grid technology, and that is the future. So there are many more iterations of transportation, but greenhouse gas emissions, I would agree with Dan that, you know, that's a key area now that needs to be addressed for decarbonization. And again, Europe is doing that, right? I mean, Volvo said they're not going to make any more fossil fuel cars. Other European manufacturers have said that. In Europe, there's a big market for electric vehicles, so, you know, the synergies are there, again, across global. In fact, Tesla's biggest customer base now outside of the country is China. Chinese, the new affluent middle class are buying electric vehicles, and therefore, again, spurring that market. So I think it's a combination of market forces, and not just U.S. market forces, but international market forces, that if we really want to achieve the goals of decarbonization.
And Lorraine, isn't this another place where utility regulators have to be nimble in ways we haven't been nimble before, to allow or even encourage partnerships between utilities and other providers to move into a space that they haven't been in, charging, for example. Right. And just as simple as perhaps rethinking decoupling, which has been a driving force in energy policy in Minnesota and elsewhere as a way to discourage energy use. But I think if you're looking at decarbonizing the environment generally, you can't think the old way anymore, and you have to break from some of the older dogmas in a way that might not sit well until you think about it.
Yeah, and I think in our jurisdiction, I know California is rethinking their jurisdiction. Initially, they prohibited utilities from owning charging stations, but I think, you know, in our state, we don't prohibit that, because obviously that's politically correct load, another revenue source for the utilities. So why not promote it and facilitate it as well? But in Hawaii, you know, again, that's rooftop PV. But that's another use for the DG. That you know, if you can control that, so that's what we're trying to incent the utilities. I mean, all the customers that have rooftop PV on their houses can use that rooftop PV to charge electric vehicles at the right time during the midday or at night in the off-peak time when we're curtailing wind. So again, it's really planning the new operation and running of the grid so that you optimize the renewables at the time. Wind blows very good at night, if consistently in Hawaii, and we've got excellent wind resources, even better than Minnesota. So they got like 75 to 80% capacity on the Big Island. That's why there was wind there first. But we don't have a lot of load. So, you know, I mean, you got great resources, but we're isolated island grid, so we don't have an energy imbalance market. So we need to, you know, everything has to balance on that island, which is a great opportunity for innovation. So I would, you know, again, echo what my fellow commissioners are saying.
All of you mentioned, you know, other states. So I assume you all look at other states and kind of learn from their, you know, mistakes or their successes. Do you see a future where all of these patchwork of different paradigms kind of converging, creating a new federalism?
I mean, I'll jump in and say I don't see a convergence, and this really kind of gets back to the beauty of federalism, and you know, as Asim said, it's always been there, but or maybe John, you said that it's always been there, but I think its importance has been highlighted in the last 9 months. There are two advantages you get from federalism. One is the obvious. You get diversity and experimentation, the old laboratory of democracy metaphor, and that's critical because in a seam state, if you try to cram a lot of wind, you're not going to get very far. That's the round peg in the square hole, or is it the square peg in the round hole? And yet natural gas isn't something that we need to depend on nearly as much in Minnesota because of all the wind we have. So you get that diversity, but another thing you get is resiliency. And I can just draw on my experience as a telecommunications lawyer for years implementing the Telecom Act of 1996. All of this excitement about displacing and breaking through the baby bell monopolies and introducing competition into the marketplace, and the cutting edge of the vanguard of the competitive carriers, AT&T, MCI, and others, they were really pushing hard for federalization and national uniformity and federal preemption of states because they thought states would be really parochial and protect the baby bell companies. Well, it worked really well during the Clinton administration, but not so well for 2 terms of George W. Bush, when all of a sudden federal policy reversed, and all of the federal policies that were supporting the introduction of competition, fell away through different interpretations, and then the leverage of federal preemption stopped states from doing what states had started to do. States pretty quickly surpassed the federal government in promoting competition and the breakup of the baby bells in ways that were far more, I think, consumer friendly. And you end up now, if you understand the communications industry, with very little competition, although there's a facade of competition. The point is, this might not surprise you, but the federal government tends to be a little more politically driven. And so you get, I think, bigger swings. States, interestingly, and I practiced in a number of states when I was in private practice for years, tend to be more policy driven. Yes, they're political and they're politically driven to some extent, but once a policy takes root in a state, it's far more sustainable than a policy, I think, in some of these areas that's first enacted at the federal level.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think we will always have our swim lanes, and those swim lanes will be interpreted judicially. But I mean, I'll give you another factor, and this is just reality. So, the average lifespan. This is myself not included. This is an incredibly competent group of commissioners. Okay, our average lifespan is actually 3 years. And so when you think about that, I am rushing like crazy to get my policy endeavors pushed out the door because you just don't know what the future holds with new governors and the like. And so I don't think the patchwork will result in something uniform because the patchwork is the patchwork. And what will end up happening is the dynamics in all of these states are different, and many times if you have a strong commission, the commission will drive the policy agenda. If you have a weak commission, private interest will drive the agenda, and that's just the reality of it.
Okay, so I am going to have a quick lightning round because I have some more questions that I want to ask. So I'm going to ask 3 questions and ask the panelists to answer really quickly, 1 word or 1 sentence answers, so that we don't wait longer than speed dating, so that we can start lunch. First, do you all support establishing a carbon price? Second, if you have a magic climate genie that could grant each of you a single wish, what would that be? And last, what is your 1 advice for a state that wants to speed up this transition to clean energy economy?
What was the second one more time?
Wish.
If you have a magic climate genie, what would your policy wish be?
Okay. Where do you want to start?
You.
They came here to listen to you, John.
You seem eager.
Yes, carbon price, cheap storage, and keep everybody at the table as you work the process.
Ditto.
That's cheating.
Darn it. I mean, I'd say yes to carbon price. Magic Genie, I think for Minnesota in particular, for solar to be successful, storage is going to be critical. And so bring down those battery storage prices would be a key part of that. And yeah, bring everybody to the table. And I guess my advice is you have to integrate stakeholder participation along with utilities into whatever process you have in place to try to achieve certain ends.
I'll just address the third, which is, yes, I think storage is actually, I believe storage is the right answer as well. On the third, I would say understand the synergy that exists between, as government, your will to do the right thing, that customers are dying for a better experience with their utilities, and utilities want to spend money. Take advantage of this symmetry right now that we have in time.
Okay. Well, I don't necessarily know that you need a carbon price. I think you just need the right tariffs to facilitate the integration of renewables, because people get hung up over what is carbon pricing, so that can be a distraction. In our state, we don't have a carbon price, but we've tried to facilitate tariffs. Magic Genie, I'd say probably encouraging innovation. Innovation is the key to American DNA, and that is where all the changes are occurring. So if we could have more innovation, whether that's the entrepreneurs coming out of the accelerators and the incubators that many energy sector folks are funding, that would be a focus. And also advice, don't forget the customers. Customers are key partners in this. We must always remember that customers are to be included in the stakeholder process. We talk about industry, private sector, regulatory sector. We owe our duties to the customer to be in the best interest of the customer, but they are to be active participants in the process, and to empower and enable customers to be part of this process is I think, a key to success.
Thank you. I would like to thank you for coming.